Lewis, coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments on whatever platform you happen to be watching on. They will show up here in my chat room, and we can communicate directly. My subject today is initiation. And um, I don't know that the things I'm going to have to say about that are anything that you're expecting, and that's just as well. Um, I'm going to start with a comment on the subject of priesthood as viewed by the Fellowship of Isis. As some of you may know, I'm a member of the Fellowship of Isis. I am actually an archpriest in the Fellowship of Isis, and through the Noble Order of Terra, a member of the Triad Union. And the Fellowship of Isis take this point of view on priesthood, that there are two types of priesthood, and those are the uncrowned priesthood and the crowned priesthood. And what do they mean by that? The uncrowned priesthood is everyone. The Fellowship of Isis takes the point of view that we're all our own priesthood. We have our own connection to deity. We interact naturally with deity, of course, more clearly when we're conscious of it. Hello to Antonio in the chat room. Every Icean has, or potentially has, their own Iceum, or shrine to Isis, which need be nothing more than their own personal altar. Hello, Janet. And everyone is viewed as being priesthood. However, there is a second category called crowned priesthood. And what that means are people who are priesthood to their community, not merely to themselves or to their family. And I've always thought that this was a very good distinction. In the Fellowship of Isis, people who are priesthood to their community are distinguished by a crown or coronet indicating their status, although they certainly don't all wear one. And hello to Renee in the chat room. But that's where the term comes from, and it is part of the investiture ceremony. And this is how I also look at priesthood, that everyone really is their own priest in their own life, um, for their own purposes, for their family, depending on their circumstances. But that doesn't mean, that is not the same as being priesthood to your community. And when we talk about initiation, we come to this same divide. Hello, Janet in the chat room. It's good to see you, Janet. Um, and so I want to first begin by making a differentiation between initiation experiences that might happen naturally in a person's spiritual growth versus those that are part of being in part of an organization. Organizations have their rules. Organizations have their customs, and not just anything is going to constitute an initiation in an organization. It must be what is set out for that organization. Sometimes it's very complex, sometimes not so much. It very much depends on the organization. Sometimes, technically, always an initiation is a beginning. But in an organization especially, and really in everyday life, it follows a period of growth and learning. So it's both a completion and a beginning. And in an organization, there will be very specific things that must be learned in most cases before that initiation can occur. And in many organizations, there may be many initiations. And that is part of the organization. And hello to Lafayette Street Media. Um, oh, and I guess Lafayette's actual name is Bimby. Good morning, Bimby. It's good to see you in the chat room. Um, so when we're talking about an initiation in an organization, it's something quite specific. Um, exactly how it occurs is individual to the organization. In some organizations, it's individual to the ceremony, individual to the person. In others, it will be always the same. Um, depends on the organization. Hello to Tim in the chat room. It's good to see you, Tim. And all of this is completely part of the nature of organizations. If you are going to belong to a particular organization, one of the things that comes with that is going along with their customs and rules. Um, now, one of the bad things that often comes with organizations is that some of them will insist that they're the only one that really matters, and anyone else's customs and rules don't count. Um, but that's like certain conservative Christian sects saying they're the only Christians on earth, and all those other Christians are not. We've all heard that. Um, when metaphysical organizations take that similar position, they sound just as ridiculous. Every organization is its own thing. They all have their own customs, and those should always be respected. In addition to what happens in organizations, however, there are initiations that happen to people who don't belong to organizations. There are initiations that just come with life. And I'm speaking of spiritual initiations. And if you have one, you will know it will make differences. Hello to Samantha in the chat room. And I believe that those things should also be respected for what they are, but they don't confer membership in an organization. Um, but I don't feel that you must belong to an organization to necessarily have had a spiritual initiation or to be anything other than a member of that organization. So, in talking about initiations today, I want to start by saying that. Now, having said that, I want to talk about what an initiation is and what you can expect from it, because I think a lot of people don't really talk about that, certainly not enough. An initiation is an energetic transformation that occurs. Um, Normally in a ceremony, sometimes simply on its own. I believe that initiation comes from our connection to spirit. Yes, we may fulfill the needs of a particular organization and have initiation that way, but the thing that makes the change, if the change is going to occur, is our own spiritual connection and spiritual growth. Another way to put that is that initiation ultimately comes from Goddess. And again, I don't feel it needs to necessarily come from an organization. It is a change in your spiritual state. If you are having the kind of ceremonial initiation you would have in an organization, let's say, we've talked a bit about the upcoming illustration here in Danville in May. A number of people will be having initiations during that weekend. That kind of initiation is highly ceremonial, but it absolutely involves a spiritual shift that occurs. And it is usually a highly emotional moment, um, a very energetic moment that people physically feel. And, many people are overcome with emotion in a positive way because this thing has occurred. And although we don't talk about the individual nature of initiations, not because they're secret, but because we want them to be new experiences for each person who has them, I don't feel that there's anything wrong in talking about what you can expect from it. So you would feel that energetic shift. You would feel that strong emotional reaction in ways that are different and individual to you. And these things have a very physical sensation to them. They are something that different people will feel them at different intensities. Different initiations may have different intensities, but you will feel it. And similarly, if we're talking about something that happens in your natural spiritual growth, you will feel that physically too. Um, initiation is that change in your spiritual state, that an expansion of your consciousness. And I have experienced many ceremonial initiations and also many that were simply part of life. And I won't say that I always quite looked at it that way, but I've learned to look at it that way. And I can remember times that um, work that I had been involved in absolutely changed my state of consciousness and my connection to spirit for the better. And I would regard that as a non-ceremonial, non-organizational initiation. And I think that people have these frequently, and they also deserve to be honored. What else is initiation going to do, however? And that's the part that we often don't talk about. And I'm not sure everyone even realizes it, but one of the things initiation is going to do, regardless of the kind of initiation, it's going to put you where you need to be. It's going to put you where you should be given that spiritual change that you're experiencing. And how you experience this is, like so many other things in life, going to depend on whether you cooperate with it or whether you fight against it. I've known many people um, for whom an initiation was a very smooth aspect of spiritual growth that led to all kinds of opening doors, but nothing particularly disruptive. I've known other people for whom an initiation was a terribly disruptive event because they weren't really where they needed to be, and Spirit put them where they needed to be in order to go forward on the path they had chosen. I can think of one person who may or may not choose to identify themselves, often does, but I'm not going to. But on the occasion of their second degree initiation, which is the one that very most often will do this to people, but within the course of, I believe, 24 hours, they lost their job, their home, and their romantic relationship all together, which led to their being in a very different place um, that was much more immediately conducive to their spiritual growth. It's where spirit needed them to be in keeping with that initiation. Um, and they will tell you looking back that it was a very good thing. Um, and in fact, some of those things came back. The relationship reestablished itself and is still going 20 years later. Um, but at the time, the initiation really changed that person's life in a very physical way. And I've seen that with a number of people on occasion. And it usually, again, is because they were not quite where they needed to be. And this will continue to happen um, if it is needed at whatever level an initiation might be, whether we're talking about um, a natural change that is part of the work that you have done, whether we're talking about a degree initiation at first, second, or third, and even sometimes rising to certain offices. Spirit will take such a hand and make such a change. It will bring out whatever flaws need to be fixed. If there are things that you need to deal with, they will be brought before you. If there are things you need to change in your life, chances are they'll be changed for you, not simply brought before you. And it can be quite an experience. That is not, in my opinion, the normal thing that happens, but it happens often, and it depends where you are. Um, there is an old thought that second degree initiation sometimes makes it seem like people have gone crazy. Because if there are things they need to work on, parts of their shadow they need to address, and are able to address at that time, they will come to the forefront. Um, Sometimes that seems like an explosion of ego right in that moment. But if the person deals with what's put in front of them, then they will move forward relatively smoothly. Sometimes people can't deal with it at that moment and they have to come back later. This is one of the things that can happen with initiation. What else can happen with initiation? Generally speaking, you'll find your psychic experiences will become more profound, depending on exactly what kind of initiation we're talking about. Your magical experiences may become more profound. Generally speaking, when we talk about initiation, we're talking about moving forward in psychic and magical ways. So, of course, you will move forward and your experiences will become more profound and um, will become a big thing in your life. And Samantha says, you will feel renewal after the ritual. Yes, you absolutely should. You should feel totally renewed, even reborn. It does have, you hear people from certain other religions speak about being born again. We don't normally say that, but it does feel in many ways like a rebirth. It feels like a re-emergence into this world in a new state. And that is really how you should feel. You should feel like you are in a new place, in a new state. Um, and depending on the nature of the initiation, you may be letting go of all kinds of old things. And that's one of the reasons that it can sometimes be disruptive, because letting go of those old things can be difficult. Initiations very often work heavily with shadow aspects of your being if you've not already dealt with them. And I would not expect someone to have um, certainly not dealt with the majority of their shadow aspects at first degree, for example. I would expect them to have done significant shadow work, but of course there will always be more there. And in fact, shadow work never goes away because as long as we live, we have that aspect. The things that we don't see clearly, the things we may not see at all, which is basically what we work with when working with the shadow. Um, but these are things that initiation will bring in front of you to be dealt with. So, my advice is if you're going to have an initiation, be prepared to deal with things. Um, Good things like feeling reborn, feeling renewed, expansion of psychic abilities, and also things like having to deal with shadow issues, having to make changes to things in your life that may no longer suit what you need. And don't regard that as a negative thing, but regard that as spirit moving you to where you need to be. And I think that that is the best way to successfully handle an initiation. I can look back on my own initiations, and some of them brought some very life changing moments. Um, and I was speaking of the Fellowship of Isis earlier. The Fellowship of Isis liturgy revolves around mystery plays, which are regarded as initiations in their own right. I can remember one in particular in Chicago that dealt with the mystery of Hades and Persephone that produced huge changes in the lives of every person who was involved in it because it was an initiation, not only for the priest who was being raised to clergy status in the ceremony, but for everyone involved. Um, and that's part of what it is. Now, hello to Calvin in the chat room. Calvin says, for me, it has opened my mind to search for more. And with that, I'm currently working toward my master's in metaphysical science, seeking more answers and doing lots of soul searching through deep meditation. Shadow. And yes, that's exactly, I think, the ideal solution. The ideal outcome of an initiation. It should open you to more. One of the things I often comment on is when I received my third degree initiation from Lady Crystal, her advice to me was absolutely not to regard this as the culmination of a spiritual journey, but rather the opening of that spiritual journey. And that we go on learning as long as we live and must do so. That our knowledge is never complete. And one of the things I found through my initiatory journey was the constant expansion of consciousness. And you hear people talk about the expansion of consciousness. But what does that mean? What it means is being able to understand things that you could not necessarily understand before. Um, the one that I most commonly will talk to is when I was first learning third degree. Some of the concepts in our Corellian third degree studies were beyond my comprehension. If you are Corellian third degree, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. If you're not, I'm talking about things like multidimensionality, the nature of reality, um, etc. And um, these things are very complex and deep concepts, and I could not understand them when I was first exposed to them, even though I was pretty good at understanding things. But these were rather beyond me. And Lady Crystal took the very wise response of saying, that's okay. We'll come back to that later. And that's exactly what we did. I would say about 6 months later, we came back to these very same things. And during that time, my consciousness had expanded, a kind of natural initiation, if you would. And I found that these very same subjects, even though we had never spoken of them in between, suddenly made perfect sense to me. I had no difficulty understanding them. And that's expansion of consciousness. It absolutely does happen. And it should happen to you in your metaphysical studies. Things that, when you first encounter them, may not initially make sense. Come back to them later, and you may find that you have no difficulty with them. And this has to do with those higher concepts like multidimensionality, like probable lifetimes, like multiple incarnations, things that aren't necessarily part of how the majority of the world looks at these things. And when you first encounter them, they can be very hard to wrap your mind around. But, if you're patient and you come back to them, you'll find your mind will wrap itself. You'll find that you will have that growth, having told spirit you want to have it, it will come. And that generally is my attitude on these things. I meet people who take the attitude when they're teaching, well, you have to master it right now, or we cannot go forward. And I think that, while certainly is their right and how they teach, is certainly not how I, as an individual, ever believed in teaching. My attitude was always, we go at your pace. We'll come back to it if we need to. And yeah, we can't go past a certain point until you get past a certain point. But it's not a race, and we'll take as long as is needed. And I think that is very important when teaching spiritual matters. Um, we want, when we're teaching spirituality, to foster the growth of our students, not to meet a certain schedule. Um, these two things are not necessarily things that work together. We have to meet people where we find them. That was one of my mother's favorite phrases, and I find that is very valuable advice. That you meet people where you find them, and then you help them to get where they need to go. Um, and if you find yourself dealing with someone who cannot at that moment understand what you're trying to say, well, then it's not the right moment to say it. And work with other things until it is time to move to that. And I think very often you'll find it will take care of itself. You can also look at other ways to introduce it, other ways to explain it, um, but to just assume that you cannot move forward because at that moment um, it is too much for the student is a mistaken assumption. Calvin says, it was my third degree studies that sparked this journey I'm currently on, seeking a deeper understanding. Absolutely. And that's really part of what third degree should do. It should tell you in part how little you actually do know, and that there's always more to learn. It's been said that the person who thinks they know everything is actually showing how little they really know. because we can never know everything. There's always more. There's always more knowledge, even sometimes on things that we think we already know. We may find that they actually go much deeper than we first realized. One of the things I remember, I did a lot of shadow work in my first and second degree studies, as we encourage Corellian students to do. And it was successful to a point. We come back to some of this in third degree. We certainly did in my case. Um, it's why we say you always continue your shadow work, because what I found is that I was only able to go so far when I first began, and later was able to go much farther with the very same things. And hello to Michael in the chat room. In my case, I found that I was, in many cases, able to to work with the understanding of subjects, but did not always get the full emotional healing because, I'm a Gemini and I tend to be very mentally focused. Um, and so in some cases, I had to come back and expand what I was doing to deal with the total subject. And that is perfectly normal. One of the things I really, and hello to Steve in the chat room, one of the things that I tend to strongly disagree with is the idea that that we ever come to that point that there isn't more to do. There always is. I can tell you, I'm now 60 years old. Will be 61 this year, and I have been in a prominent position most of my life. Um, I have had adventures that few people have had. I think I can reasonably say that. I've had adventures and misadventures few people have had, and both physically and spiritually. And I would not begin to say that I know everything there is to know um, about anything. There's always more to learn. Um, and those things can be, they can sometimes be deeply fascinating. Sometimes they're deeply shocking when certain things reveal themselves in life. But there's always more to learn. We would not be reincarnated multiple times if there was not always more to learn. And I think that one of the great secrets of life is to enjoy that process of learning as much as we can. Now, sometimes it can be disruptive and hard to enjoy, but if we remember that it's all for our growth, all for our ultimate spiritual benefit, we can come to value all of it. Sometimes after it's happened, hopefully while it's happening. But this is what initiation is about. It's about um, that spiritual change that we experience as we go forward in our spiritual journey. And Calvin adds that it's all equally exciting. It truly should be. Um, and ideally, we will find it that way. And if we don't necessarily find it that way in the moment, we should always hope to find it that way later. Now, I see that we've come to the end of our half hour. There's certainly more that I could say on this subject, but we've come to the end of our half hour. And tomorrow, my guest will be Ed the Pagan, who will be talking about his upcoming class on the subject of pagan power. And this will be a very interesting program, um, talking about a variety of aspects of what we might mean by the phrase pagan power. I hope that you will join us for it. I think you'll find it very enlightening on that subject of always more to learn. On Wednesday, I'll have Chris Copeland talking about our newest projects at Corellian Publishing. On Thursday, I'm going to talk about the recent IVF, in vitro fertilization ruling out of Alabama, and the nature of life, and ideas about when a life begins and what constitutes a life. And then on Friday, we're going to have a roundup of interesting stories from the week that I've seen in various places. So that's our week schedule. I'm going to start trying to have my week scheduled a little farther in advance. And I hope that that is helpful to you. And with that, let us close with our prayer, as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives, and we ask you to help us to always be open to the change and growth that life offers us. Help us to keep our hearts open and our minds flexible so that we continue to grow as long as we possibly can, and help us to enjoy that growth and to make the most of it. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great thanks, and knowing you are always with us, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence. I will see you tomorrow, and may you be blessed now and always.